Really, this entire lobster theory is all for him to point out that hierarchies simply exist, which is a thing that is absolutely true and provable without even mentioning the word lobster. Like, just look at monkeys, man. Not sure if you realize this, but primates are like closer to humans than lobsters. And if the point of lobsters is to show how hierarchies are super old or whatever, then just look at studies that point that out. Heck, we know that human hierarchies have been around for at least 7,000 years. Why is he bringing up lobster serotonin into this? Well, if I were a betting man, which I am, I would wager that Peterson likes lobsters because it implies human hierarchy of a specific shape is somehow built into the foundation of our DNA.
One of the truisms for what constitutes real from a Darwinian perspective is that which has been around the longest period of time, right? Because it's had the longest period of time to exert selection pressure. Well, we know we evolved and lived in trees, something on the order of 60 million years ago. We're talking 10 times as far back as that for the hierarchy. And so the idea that human beings, that the hierarchy is something that has exerted selection pressure on human beings is, I don't think that's not a disputable issue.
See how he makes that triangle with his hands when he says hierarchy? That shape is, of course, what we commonly associate with the hierarchy, as in a system where people or groups are ranked with few or one at the top, but that's not exclusive to what a hierarchy can look like. Lionesses and female mongooses communally take care of their young, for example. African wild dogs will have a dominant pair in each hunting pack, but are largely social and don't have an aggressive hierarchy beyond that, and even take care of their own sick and wounded. The point being that hierarchies are indeed everywhere in nature and society, but don't necessarily adhere to that shape he's always doing with his hands. Not to mention that you can easily rethink or redefine that structure. Corporations have a board of directors and not a single person. Co-op businesses function through democracy, and so on. But what Jordan is setting up here is that very rigid version of a hierarchy, few at the top, pyramid shape, is the natural, older than trees, unchangeable hierarchy he wants to push with his lobster theory. He goes on after this inspiring clip to talk about it from a Darwinian perspective. Darwinian here is notably a placeholder for survival of the fittest. That's what he's actually talking about. He is justifying this specific hierarchy in his mind because chemicals made lobsters fight to get a limited resource. But he's also omitting how those hierarchies are created and change because of the environment. A species with lots of space and resources like giraffes tend to have no dominance hierarchy in the wild. But when they're put in a zoo where they share a small space and limited trees, that dynamic changes, much like the prison rules of that debunked alpha dog study. But by presenting this one pyramid-shaped hierarchy as some kind of unwavering truth, he's laying a specific groundwork based on bad science for how he can discuss other issues like poverty and sexism and racism, a shorthand he can refer back to.
Organisms that have to cooperate and compete with other organisms of their type inevitably arrange themselves into hierarchies, and that's been going on for so long, which is at least 300 million years, that our nervous systems have adapted to hierarchies as if they're a permanent element of being, right? More permanent than trees, like seriously permanent. The most fundamental neurochemical, the one that regulates the entire brain, serotonin, is acutely sensitive to hierarchical distinctions. And so that's part of the proposition. So the reason I laid that proposition forward was to say, whatever pitfalls hierarchies might produce, you cannot lay them at the feet of the West, patriarchy, or capitalism. It's like, that's a non-starter. You're wrong.
See, he's circling real studies about how the chemicals in our brains will react to our social status, but the conclusion he's drawing is absurd, mainly because he's equating stuff like the patriarchy or capitalism with natural hierarchies. And so again, I think that's why he's using the lobster comparison, to cover up the reality that today's human hierarchies, as in very few at the top, are absolutely artificial and, more importantly, malleable. In fact, scientists generally believe that our ancestors were largely egalitarian, as in considered those within their tribes as equals, before agriculture created a more rigid and unfair hierarchy. That isn't to say that hierarchies didn't exist before that. Lobsters prove that they did. But this information really seems to imply that the concept of a really rigid hierarchy, the pyramid he's making with his hands, or literal pyramids, started with our first big industry. Agriculture on a large scale creates the need for distribution and supervision and leads to fewer people at the very top. And while that was vital to our society today, that information creates a pesky gray area when actually talking about how hierarchies work, or should work, or could work. It implies that the shape of them is a social construct and therefore can be changed. And I don't think that works with Peterson's worldview. So instead of talking about this, he talks about a bunch of roided up lobsters that have nothing to do with humans. But once you believe his lie that number one, rigid hierarchies are in our nature, and number two, concepts like capitalism are synonymous with natural hierarchies, you can then be taken on a much more insidious journey.
And when you implement a solution to a complex problem socially, you produce a hierarchy because some people are better at the implementation than others. So there's a hierarchy of competence, and then there's a hierarchy of distribution of the spoils. And in both of those hierarchies, you get a disproportionate clumping of resources at the top and dispossession at the bottom. It's in the nature of hierarchies. So what's the left for? The left is to remind those who are benefiting from the hierarchies that the hierarchy comes at a cost. And the cost is the clumping of people at the bottom. And that's an eternal cost, and it's not trivial. And so that's what the left should be properly focused on. The left should be providing the voice of those who are dispossessed by hierarchies. And the right should be saying, yeah, but the damn hierarchies are necessary. And they're not only necessary, but they're also productive. Then the left says, yes, but they tilt towards tyranny, and they can be occupied inappropriately by people who are playing games of power. Fair enough, the right has to take that into account. The hierarchy can rigidify, and is likely to do that, and it can be taken over by people who are corrupt, and that's likely to happen. And so, but it's okay, because the dialogue can work out. The right can say, well, yeah, we need the damn hierarchies and they need to be buttressed. And the left can say, yes, but they have to be maintained properly so they don't deteriorate and degenerate. And I think that's ancient wisdom. I think the ancient Egyptians had figured that out in their symbolic representations.
Ah yes, ancient Egyptians, famously known for taking care of the people at the bottom. This is where we get back around to Jordan's teaching style and why I think he seems reasonable to some people. He's speaking from a centrist perspective and pointing out flaws from the right and the left, but mostly the left, which makes him seem unbiased and logical and an intellectual and all that. Of course, he's also stating a lot of personal opinions like they are facts, which his students and fans might not pick up on. But putting aside the fact that this is all based on a flawed perception of what a hierarchy is, or his weird conclusion that every hierarchy is the same shape, or that every hierarchy not only necessitates but also reflects competency, here's how Jordan finishes his thought.
So the left can't just demolish the hierarchies in the name of some equality of outcome, let's say, because you blow out the future, you leave people aimless, and you destroy the very institutions that allow people to make competent progress in the world. That's not an acceptable outcome. So we have to agree to live with the tension. Necessity for hierarchies, the proclivity for them to pathologize, and the necessary voice of the left in speaking for the dispossessed.
So his conclusion to all of this hierarchy talk is that we should do nothing. It's all just fine the way it is. How very, very convenient. So just to recap, using bad science, Jordan Peterson laid down this foundational idea that hierarchies, specifically every dominance hierarchy shaped like a pyramid, are rooted in our nature, ignoring the fact that more rigid and unequal hierarchies are actually artificial. And just because something is in nature doesn't mean it's good or necessary every time you see it. He then lumps in other artificial constructs like capitalism and the patriarchy into this broad concept of hierarchy, framing them as unmovable concepts we can't do anything about. He's a guy in medieval Europe confidently saying feudalism is good and natural, and we need it because the concept of hierarchies has existed since before dragons or whatever. Next, he takes the stance of an unbiased academic, stepping outside of politics to ponder what this all means, and then concludes that ultimately there isn't anything to be done, and that the people on the left pushing for change are incorrect to do that. And to make it seem centrist and logical, he says it's the duty of the right to recognize the injustice that comes with what he's spun into a natural occurrence. Except that's very conveniently a conservative view, isn't it? Because the truth he's laid out, while pretending it's an impartial idea, actually supports right-wing beliefs by pretending the very concept of capitalism or whatever the current system is is natural because it involves hierarchies. And then his conclusion is that the right wing doesn't have to change at all. It's a magic trick. Flim-flam, as the kids say. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.